Today is September 19th, 1997. We're interviewing Beatrice Muchman. Her name at birth was Westheimer. Interviewer Sheila Roden Novak. We're doing this in Flossmoor, Illinois, US of A, in English. Today is September 19th, 1997. We are conducting an interview with Beatrice Muchman. My name is Sheila Roden Novak, and we're in Flossmoor, Illinois. Trixie, I want to thank you very much for letting us interview you today. Would you please tell us your current name and how do you spell it?
My current name is Beatrice Muchman, M-U-C-H-M-A-N.
And what was your name at birth and how did you spell it?
My name at birth was Beatrice Westheimer, actually Beatrix with an X, Westheimer, W-E-S-T-H-E-I-M-E-R.
And what is your birth date?
And my birth date is June 6, 1933.
And have you ever been known by any other names?
Oh, I've had a few. I've been known by first Westheimer, then I've been known by Duché, which was my name change during the war, D-U-C-H-E-T. Then I was known by Beatrice Louis when I was adopted, L-E-W-Y. And then I became Muchman.
And what is your current age?
And my current age is 64.
And would you tell us the city and country of your birth?
I was born in Berlin, Germany.
Okay, would you please tell us what kind of a child you were growing up?
What kind of a child I was? Well, I have many warm, though fuzzy memories of growing up. My grandmother had a very large family. She had some 7 brothers and sisters. Some of whom I remember, especially her oldest brother, who was the most affluent brother in the family and ran all the party functions.
What was his name?
His name was Bernard Baruch, and that was my grandmother's maiden name. And he would have huge family affairs that I would attend, and he was known to kiss wildly, which I hated. So my grandmother would always rescue me from his kisses and hugs. Those were usually functions that had to do with the Jewish holidays, though I can't presently identify what the holidays were. But my mother and father were very devoted. Mother and father were very devoted. I was an only child, and as I remember, certainly the apple of their eye, I'm sure I gave them difficult moments. The most vivid memory, and probably because it was the most horrific memory, is of Kristallnacht, which I didn't understand then, and I didn't understand for a very, very long time. I actually thought I played a part in it. I remember glass breaking. I remember noises. I remember my father's anxiety, my mother's anxiety. I remember thinking that the drapes, the curtains in my room were on fire, and that I had something to do with setting the fire, probably because I came out of a sound sleep. And of course, there was fire outside. Our synagogue was being burned. Whether I was aware, voices and noises and crowds, which to this day frighten me no end, is the thing that I understood in 1938. So those are the things that I took away with me. And of course later it was all explained to me. And I knew rapidly after that that things were deteriorating. There wasn't going to be a kindergarten for me. There were a lot of hushed up family voices, family meetings. And shortly thereafter we left Berlin.
Let's back up a little bit before
Yes.
you left Berlin. What is your best memory as a child?
my best memory of my best memory of being a child is being surrounded by my parents, climbing into their bed in the morning, and creating some little conflicts over that because my mother and father did not love being awakened at the hours at which I awakened them. But I remember the laughter, the wonderful feeling of being part of this twosome that was so important to me. And those are the good, warm memories that stood me in very good stead later in my life.
Would you tell us I don't believe you told us your grandmother's name. What is her name?
My grandmother's name, which I called my grandmother Oma, for grandmother in German, and her name was Johanna Baruch, Baruch, of course. She was a vital force in my life, even at that time, though she came into play much more so later. And I remember her better at later dates, for her role in my life at later dates.
Now, Baruch was her maiden name. What was her married name?
Yes, and no, actually, that her married name was Baruch. And I don't know her maiden name.
And what were your parents' names?
Wait a minute, I'm getting confused. Baruch was her maiden name. Boaz was her married name. So much for all these names in my life. Boaz, Boas, and that, of course, was my mother's maiden name.
And your mother's first name?
And my mother's first name was Meta. She was called Meta, M-E-T-A.
And your father's name?
And his name was Julius, often called Jule, J-U-L-L-E.
When you think about your mother, what images come to your mind?
My mother was beautiful, and my father was very handsome. My mother was beautiful. I remember my mother very much always in design. She always had a pad of paper in front of her. She was always drawing something. She was frequently at the sewing machine because she was a commercial designer, and she showed me how to draw bodies that would then be clothed, and this is still part of my fiddles. When I nervously fiddle around, I still want to be drawing bodies. I remember, that's what I really remember about my mother.
And what images come to mind when you think of your father?
And my father was also a very handsome man. He was the stern person in the family. He would reprimand. I remember that quite well. He had a temper. I remember that quite well. And many opinions. My father always had opinions. That must be where I get it from. But also a man who was very optimistic. My mother was the quieter person of the two.
And do you remember having aunts and uncles and cousins around?
Yes. Now, in Berlin, the aunts and uncles and cousins did not play as much of a part, partially because one aunt and uncle left when I was really small. One aunt and uncle left shortly thereafter. A cousin who became my dearest friend in life when we emigrated to Belgium, but did not play much of a part in Berlin. I remember family functions with older adults more than I remember younger adults.
And tell me about your friends growing up in Berlin.
You know, I actually do not remember having friends as such. I think, it can probably be explained that life, those first 4 or 5 years of my life was probably a very stress-filled part of my life for my parents, and the family was the hub. Perhaps I had friends and I just don't remember.
Do you recall a favorite toy or a favorite game or activity that you liked to do when you were little?
Not really. I just like to be wherever my parents were.
And on these occasions when you celebrated the Jewish holidays, do you remember where people sat or some of the foods that might have been served?
You know, the foods that I remember are smells. I remember the women floating around and looking beautiful, and smells of well prepared foods. There were maids in those days to help, and I remember sneaking in the kitchen and getting tastes. What it was I tasted, I don't remember, and whether it defined my present taste, I can't be sure. But I remember loving to get dressed up. That was, my mother had her mind set on my being a photographer, that is a model for a photographer. So she would make these beautiful clothes, and I loved getting dressed up and wearing them.
Did you actually become a photographer's model?
I did. I did.
In your home, when you and your parents had dinner, do you remember where each of you sat at the table? Were there specific seats?
There were specific seats. Whether it was a stringent rule or not, I don't remember. I was always between my mother and my father. And when my grandmother came to visit, she was the guest of honor. Everybody fussed over my grandmother.
And who got served first, or who ate first? Do you remember?
No. I think we all ate together. I don't remember eating alone as such, because I just don't remember my parents going out and being left with even my grandmother or babysitters. It's not part of my recollection.
Do you remember any special trips that you might have taken with your parents?
Not at that time.
Day trips, vacations, nothing?
Not at that time. Not until we immigrated to Belgium.
And what was your daily life like when you were in Berlin?
There must have been a lot of eavesdropping involved in my daily life. I certainly remember doing a lot of listening at doors and voices going on around me. But I don't have a specific recollection of my daily life.
Were you old enough to go to school at that time?
No, I didn't go to school. And I think I think that I was meant to go to school, because I remember discussions taking place and preparations being made, but I didn't. I was not sent to school.
Did a teacher come to your home at all?
No.
Do you recall any religious instruction at that time?
No, there was none. But we did go to synagogue. I remember that.
What was that
I
like?
remember, it was warm. All those memories are good memories. It was a very important thing to do, because my father would be the usher. And we wore special clothes, and it was all wonderful sharing of experiences with my family.
In the synagogue that you went to, were the men and women separated?
I don't remember. I've been asked that question. I don't remember. But since I sat with my mother, it's a possibility that they were.
Do you remember anything about the synagogue, what it looked like or felt like? Or
It gets mixed up with other synagogues, but it's an awesome memory. I remember it as a quiet, sort of a genteel experience.
do you recall what your family's relationship might have been with the non-Jewish community at that time in your life?
Probably. Well, there are a lot of stories that have gotten mixed into this, so my actual recollection it's not an accurate recollection, but I was told by my uncle, who later adopted me, that it was a wonderful relationship, that the maids, the neighbors, that people at a time when Jews were no longer allowed to purchase groceries, that non-Jewish neighbors would come with milk. And it's something that my uncle has never really he never forgot it in his lifetime and paid homage to it. It was not something I understood, but I don't remember being without groceries or milk or any of the necessary. But a lot of people who worked for my family had been known, according to stories I heard, to actually save various things that belonged to the family all through the war and return them after the war. So there were people who took individual responsibility even then.
And you mentioned your mother was a commercial designer.
Yes.
Where did she work?
You know, I don't know that. I don't know that. I would imagine, again, because of the political climate, that she freelanced. And she worked where she could. My grandfather had a small publishing house. And my mother, who was one of 4 sisters, worked for my grandmother, for my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandmother was very active in that publishing house also. So before she was married, I know she worked for the family business. Whether she did so afterwards when I was little, I doubt that. It just wasn't the thing to do, and no one ever confirmed that for me. But she worked at home.
Do you have any memory of your grandfather?
No, my grandfather was dead. My grandfather was dead actually when my mother got married, so I never knew him.
And what kind of work did your father do?
And my father was a salesman. And I've been asked this question before, a salesman for what? Because I again remember aromas from childhood, I think at the time, although at the very beginning I know he worked for a bank, but it's not anything that I remember, it's things that are in black and white. And then afterwards, I think when these kinds of formal positions were closed to Jews, he must have represented foods or in some way sold foods.
What are some of the aromas you remember? Are there any distinct ones?
Oh, it's sausage. It's sausage. And just gourmet foods. And I do remember his coming to the door with these things. And even later in my Belgian life, I have these memories.
Do you recall any experiences of anti-Semitism?
Other than Kristallnacht in Berlin, though they surely took place, I have no record. I was surely sheltered, as were all little children, I'm sure, who lived in this kind of environment. I don't overtly remember them as a little child in Berlin. And I was not yet 5 years old, so these were all memories, more or less, until the age of 4.
And you mentioned a little bit about Kristallnacht. How did that actually affect you?
It frightened me terribly. Trying to remember how a child would feel, it spelled the end of the world that I knew. And always, there's the fear that I might lose my mother or might lose my father, who were the very essence of life for me. And after that, life became very silent. From being a little child in a chatterbox, I had to understand silence. And being a grandmother today and watching young children, I wonder how children in those days understood silence. But I surely understood it.
And you remember that?
And I remember that. I remember that.
How did things change in your home after that?
Things became very tense, very argumentative, and very silent and hushed and whispered. So things did change drastically. It was almost in my memory, and you know, again, these are selective memories, but it was almost a one day to another change.
Do you remember the morning after Kristallnacht? Did you go outside?
Yes, to shattered glass, to destruction.
What did that look like to you?
Though I had no experience with war, you know, today I would use the word war. It was total destruction. And realizing that I had not set my drapes on fire, that I had not done a bad thing, was something, you know, that required a little more understanding. It was a shattering experience, no pun intended here, of course. It was.
Do you remember any smells from that time?
No. No.
And what happened next after Kristallnacht? What happened then to your family?
Then my family, instead of being a wonderful open dining room table experiences, my family really shut into itself, and discussions took place, I remember, with my grandmother. More or less, I do not remember. All the other relatives did not come into this, and I think that's because only an aunt and uncle and my parents emigrated to Belgium. So only this part of the family was in on the discussions, but I never knew really what it was we were going to do. This was not shared with children. So in a way, it became more frightening because it wasn't shared. And the day we left was almost like a day of being transported from one day to another. I know certainly there was a logical way of getting to the border. And there were people who had been paid to do this, not anything I understood at the time. But I did understand that altogether we weren't to trust those people either. I remember being told that if I spoke, there were dogs, and these dogs would kill. The word Nazi didn't really make sense, but I knew there were people, bad people, and silence was of the essence. I know we left our house without any of the lovely things in it, and we wore all the underwear we could wear. We transported whatever. I know my grandmother wanted to take everything. I remember an argument between my grandmother and my father, which at that time already were not unusual, and being dictated that we only take the bare minimum. And then this long march began. And of course, to me, it was really a long march. I don't remember whether it was a day or a night. It was not a day, it was a night. I think it was only one night, but it could have been 10 nights. It was an endless night.
Do you remember what the date was?
It was in March.
Of?
At that time, in March of 1939. And it was, well, right, in November it was Kristallnacht. And it took those months, and actually it's not a long time to make a decision to just leave everything behind and go. But this was not within my understanding. I only knew that it was cold, and it was wet, and it was damp, and it was awful. And I had to be quiet. And I sat on my father's shoulders. My poor father. For all those hours.
And where did you sleep?
I don't remember sleeping. And I think we marched the night through. There was no sleep. There was no stopping until we got to the end of the border, where we were met, and we were very fortunate. These guards, these people who escorted us were obviously honest. Many were not. And they did bring us into other honest hands in Belgium where it was daylight. And that's the recollection I have.
And who all was included in this march with you?
In this march was the aunt and uncle who would later adopt me.
And their names?
When my name became Louis, that was Werner and Margot Louis. And their son, who was a year older than I was at the time, I was 5, he was 6, Bernd, and myself, my mother, and my father. And of course, my grandmother.
And what happened, you said your mother was one of 4 sisters. What happened with the other 2 sisters?
The very youngest sister had emigrated in, about 1935.
And what was her name?
And her name was Hella. Her name was also Horwitz. There were 2 Horwitz. Her husband's name was Walter Horwitz. They had a daughter, Flory. And then there was the oldest of the 4 sisters. That was the youngest sister. Then there was the oldest sister. Her name was Frida. Her husband's name was also Walter, and also Horwitz. So they had immigrated around 36, and their child was my cousin Henry, who is the cousin with whom I was later visibly hidden in the country in Belgium.
Where did they, so they immigrated
They
to
immigrated to Belgium, and the youngest sister and brother were lucky, they immigrated to the United States. It was a matter of being lucky and a matter of being smart.
And why did your parents and Walter and Margot not leave?
Well, why? I often think to myself, could I do this today? Because one of the great reasons for my mother, and letters later have shown me that, it was my grandmother. My mother adored my grandmother, and my grandfather had been in the German army. My grandmother never thought this would last. You know, these are stories that have been told so many times. German Jews felt very comfortable in their country. So they waited until there was no more waiting.
And Walter and Margot?
And Walter and Margot waited with them. Walter and Margot were then fortunate to be able to emigrate from Belgium to the United States. That was the intention of everybody, to go to Belgium and then follow to the United States. Visas were also very difficult to get. You had to get in on the right, just on that period of time in bureaucracy when your number was up, and it was a problem.
Okay, we're going to have to stop the tape right here. Tape number 2. Trixie said that there were a few things you wanted to correct that we talked about.
The first correction that I need to address now that we're moving into a different phase of life is that the youngest sister was married to a man by the name of Walter Tausk, Tausk, who now this family does not enter my recollection in my very young years because they are the ones that immigrated to the United States. Also, my father was an orphan. He had been raised as an orphan so that there was no remaining family in Berlin. Therefore, in all of Germany, actually, he became part of my mother's family, and his family already, whatever was remaining, was in the United States.
And did he have any contact with them?
He had contact once we got to Belgium because he was trying desperately to get a visa. And he was writing. Now, these are stories, again, that were told me. I knew there was frantic efforts made all the time. But exactly how these efforts took place, I don't know, but my father was writing Max Westheimer in this country. Max Westheimer would have been his uncle, probably his paternal uncle. And what I remember most about getting to Brussels was this euphoric joy at being reunited with the family and now going on this wonderful vacation in Blankenbergen, which was the cold, damp coast of Belgium, but enjoying the sense of being reunited with aunts and uncles and having a very wonderfully normal family feeling. All around us, obviously things were not normal, but I was not aware. My parents, the only thing that made me aware of any kind of chaos was my parents now being gone a great deal during the day and my grandmother coming to take care of me in a more full-time sense of the word. And of course my parents were busy trying to get visas. And the bureaucracy was obviously unbelievable, unbeknownst to me. But I knew we were trying to get to the United States. America was quite a word for young Jewish children at that time. Now I did attend school. And I loved school. I thought it was just the most wonderful thing. And I was a very good student. I learned French almost immediately. And I was very impatient with my mother for not learning it. My father was arrested almost as soon as we got to Brussels because being German, Germans were the enemy for the Belgians, and the Belgians did not understand very much about being Jewish. They didn't know that the immigrants who lived in Belgium were as much hunted by the Germans as were the Belgians. So my father was arrested and sent to Camp Gers in France. There were many camps, holding kinds of camps in France. And this was for political reasons because they felt he was German and there was no explaining it. He went with now Walter Horwitz, his brother-in-law, my cousin Henry's father. And of course the sisters became very close. My grandmother would take turns taking care of the children, and it was not a wonderful time. I was not allowed to speak about this in school. It was kept a secret. Actually, in those days, your father had to sign your report card. So my mother took over, and when she stopped forging my father's first name, she started inserting initials, and then eventually she would sign her own name. And I don't remember very much about that period of time. I remember that I remember the effort of trying to, the two sisters talking about getting their husbands home, our father. I remember the financial stress of being without my father. I remember thinking I would never see my father again. I thought he was dead. And then I remember my father coming home one night and looking much like someone I couldn't identify. He had been very, very ill. He had had typhoid and had escaped. But whether this is my own recollection exactly or gets mixed in with what I've been told or letters that I've since found and read, I just can't be sure. But I loved my father dearly. And though he frightened me at the time, I just was so thrilled to see my mother happy again and our little family together. Life was never quite the same. It was never again a pre-war Berlin. The total sense of warmth, the togetherness was never quite there, but life still revolved around me in my egotistical, childlike way. You know, I remember dancing lessons and acrobatic lessons, and my mother being totally focused on me, and my father being totally focused on me. Now, whether this is something that all children like to think, and I do believe all children do like to think that, or whether this was a fact in my family, a unique fact, I can't say. But it is my recollection. I think that those resources saved me as a human being, to be able to remember that I was so much the focus of anyone's love has stood me in great stead through my lifetime.
You spoke earlier about some of the frightening things and fear. How did you deal with that fear?
Always through fantasy. I was taught those things. My mother always wanted me to be Shirley Temple, a movie star, a singer, a dancer. All those lessons were made available to me, and I would readily slip right into it. So reality only played a part up to a point. My cousin, Henry, with whom I was to spend 2 very close-knit years, was my dear, dear friend. We didn't have other friends. It would have gotten too close for comfort. But he and I would imagine being the stars of whatever movie we had seen recently with our grandmother, and we played the days away. And we didn't really choose to focus on those dreadful fears that came back every night, of course. But fantasy was definitely my right hand. It helped out a lot. So as a little child, when I couldn't cope, I became whatever, some movie star.
At night, when these fears came back to you, how did they come out? In crying?
In crying and nightmares. In going into my mother and same beds, still my mother and father's bed. But of course, my mother and father at that time were no longer able to quite give the comfort. Or maybe they didn't feel as secure anymore because I knew they weren't. I knew my father, you know, I'm assuming these things. It felt that they were no longer as safe as they had been in Berlin, because now I realize that my father could be gone and could be taken away, that my mother could in effect fall apart with grief, as she did. So the coziness and the protection was no longer as real as it had once been. Maybe that's just called growing up.
How did you deal with your mother's grief?
Not nicely enough. You know, much like a child. I've thought about that so often. My grandmother too. Not kindly enough. Impatiently, I wanted to play. I wanted to be away from it. I couldn't quite face my mother in this kind of situation. And my mother at that point was still at a sewing machine and still working, but now she was working really to earn a living. I remember my mother being ill a lot of the time. It was no longer glamorous. It was a matter of eating. It was a matter of sheer survival, and I knew it. And I think I didn't quite want to cope with it.
Do you recall what kind of illness she had or how they dealt with that illness?
They used to call it female trouble. And possibly that's what it was. My mother always felt it had something to do with using the sewing machine a lot. And you know, at that time people used a sewing machine with their feet. That's how pedals worked. So one of the things that I cannot do today is use a sewing machine. She never wanted me near anything that had to do with sewing because she really believed it made her ill. Of course, it wasn't the sewing machine that made her ill. It could have been, well, she was young for any time in her life that it probably was the stress, but she was ill. She wasn't in pain or perhaps stress-induced.
Do you recall doctors coming to the home?
Absolutely never. No. Doctors. It was already a time of hiding in Brussels. There were no doctors. One just simply did the best one could do. I didn't even understand how we were supported financially. I knew we were selling things that my grandmother owned and things that we owned, but I didn't understand it exactly. And we were supported by an underground, a Jewish underground that was, a Jewish and non-Jewish underground that was actively at work in Belgium. But I didn't understand that. I didn't know. I was never hungry. I was never wanting for anything.
And during this time, you indicated that you were taking dance lessons and acrobatics. Were there any specific instructions that your parents gave you when you went out?
I never spoke about that my father had been gone, and until the Jewish Star came into my life, at which time, of course, being Jewish became official. I never spoke about being Jewish either. But I had mastered French so well, for obvious reasons, and being very young, of course, it was easy to master a language, that I never needed to tell anyone that I was Jewish. And it was understood. By that time, I knew being Jewish was not good. So we did not talk about being Jewish. When the star, the yellow star, came into the picture, I remember the moment, because again my mother was sewing. But this time, this was something serious. And I had made up my mind that the star would be sewn, and of course, I'm sure it wasn't something I made up all by myself, that it would be sewn on a jacket, and I would carry that jacket over my arm. No matter what the temperature, I was not going to show that star. It was too humiliating.
When was this? What was the date? Do you recall?
This happened, it had already been a law long before. This happened in May 1942. That officially this was a law long before, I'm certain of that. But in Belgium, the Belgian population tried to protect the Jews for just about as long as it was able, and it not being necessarily the government, it really being various Belgian institutions and people. And I remember our landlady being wonderful, and I remember doing this in school. I don't ever remember any anti-Semitic remarks in school, but I was then just taken out of school very quickly. And almost as an overnight thing, after the Jewish Star came along, I was taken out of school. I was whisked on a train with my cousin and my father, supposedly to attend a summer camp in the country. No one spoke in terms of this might be forever or this is why. No one explained much. It was another play opportunity, much like the lessons I had taken. Only my father's face, only the fearful attitude really told me as a child that this was a little more than some joyful experience. But I never thought that we weren't going to be picked, that I wasn't going to be picked up at the end of the summer. I went with my cousin, and I remember that train ride. I remember Germans on the train. I remember the language episode coming into play. Do not act as though you understand one word. Silence is required. Speak only French. My father spoke some French. He certainly would have been identified as a German immediately. He didn't whatever that means, but he didn't look Jewish. And so he was the chosen person to take us on the train, because other members of the family, the women, were considered to look more Semitic, and my father dictated silence to us. So for this train ride, which was probably only some 25 kilometers, but an eternity of silence, we in effect hardly spoke. We understood everything that was being said around us.
And what was being said?
Oh, German soldiers were simply navigating in my native language, but we dare not look at them. We dared not. We simply were non-entities. We became non-entities. Now, at that time, this was in 1942, when we arrived in this little town, I had really never, other than this one brief vacation to the country, to the beach actually, I had never traveled anywhere in Belgium. Not that I recollect anyhow, and chances are I didn't. So coming to this little village was an unbelievable experience. Here I was, a city child, more or less in a state of hiding. In other words, there wasn't so much freedom. We lived in 2 rooms. Here was all the space and the country and this wonderful little house in the country. I really thought it was going to be a wonderful summer of fun. And although we had a few moments when my father left, basically we were not, it was okay. It was an experience that we thought we would enjoy.
Do you recall what your mother said to you when you were leaving?
And it's a great regret in my life. I don't even remember my mother saying goodbye. And I often wondered why, whether my mother, having become a mother myself, I wonder whether my mother couldn't bear to say goodbye. Was she not there? Or did I, again, not choose to acknowledge her grief? So it's out of my memory. I don't remember, and I never saw my mother again at this point. So it was a totally unresolved goodbye. I've had to make a few of those in my life.
And what was the name of the town you were brought to?
Ottignies, Ottignies.
And how did your father happen to pick that place?
At that time, the Catholic community came forth. This was all underground. It was a network of information that I was told about later. I had no idea how we came to this town or these people. But these people had volunteered to take in Jewish children. And my parents had the names of these people. Actually, the choices were a convent, private citizens, priests had come forth. And these citizens, I think that, there was very little time. One could not look up references. So my parents just came to this decision. It was a wonderful decision. These people were kind and loving, 2 sisters to each other.
And their names?
Catholics. Jeanne, which would be an English Jeannie, Jeanne, Duchet, Duchet, and Adele, Adele, Pensis, Pensis. Very strongly, I was drawn to Jeanne Duchet. And she was later to become my godmother. When I was baptized, I had a First Communion. And she became definitely a mother figure to me. The other woman, whom I called Aunt Adele, navigated back and forth. She visited relatives. She was less involved with us, though she was there, but she left less of an impression. My first love was the older sister who was to become marraine, meaning godmother.
Okay, let's back up just a little bit.
Yes.
So you and your cousin Henri got to their home.
Yes.
And what happened next?
Basically, my father left almost very quickly. And I was torn between not wanting him to leave and being very sad about it and thinking, oh, well, you know, the sooner he leaves, the more fun Henry and I will have. So I remember always this underlying fear of losing because I knew this could happen. And then not wanting to really, like a child, not wanting to face that fear and just wanting to have a good time with the experience at hand. And at that, I remember seeing my father walk off and thinking, oh, is this forever? And just letting go of that thought very quickly.
How old were you at this time?
I was 9.
And what did your father say to you when he left?
Au revoir, mon bébé. Bye, little baby. You know, those things I remember. It was in his voice and in his tears that I knew this couldn't just be some wonderful summer camp experience. And the whole scene around me told me that too, I'm sure.
Had you ever met these ladies before?
Never.
So how did you feel being suddenly left with strangers?
Quickly at home, they were kind and welcoming, not fussy, and understanding. And those are just feelings that I had. They weren't things that I could put into words. But because we were given a great deal of freedom, that we were totally unaccustomed to. We had no freedom in our homes. We couldn't walk when we wanted to walk. We couldn't go where we wanted to go. We couldn't play when we wanted to play. Here was all this freedom, which put these women in a very good light, of course. Partially it was a matter of circumstances. They could allow us this freedom. And they were very earthy. There was no attempt made to hide anything. I mean, at that point, we knew we were Jewish. Our parents had given permission for conversion. Whether we really understood this or not, I'm not sure. We loved the pageantry of it all, the baptism, the secrecy. It was another movie for us as children. And life in the village with these women was a wonderful, receptive, and again, very luckily for me, a loving experience. I always made it my business to be loved. I wanted to be wonderful. I wanted to be good. I wanted to do the best with whatever I was presented with, which involved being a good worker it was a little mini farm, and there were chickens and berries to be picked and vegetables to be. I wanted to be the best worker. I was always competing with my cousin, who of course also wanted to be the best worker. And in this way, I felt in control because I felt that I could try to be the best at everything, the strongest, the best, the most loved. So I do remember as a child taking control of those issues. And that stayed with me too.
How was the house laid out? Where did you sleep? Where did you
We
eat?
slept, the house, well, only one room was heated at a time at all times. But of course, we got there in summer, so heat was not a problem. On the first floor, there was a salon or a living area. And beyond that, that was facing this long, stretched out backyard with all kinds of vegetables and fruits being planted. The backyard played a big part in our lives, of course. Then towards the front of the house, there was an eating area. There was a basement. You opened up a trap door and marched all the way down, and that became a very important part of our lives because all the fruits, all the vegetables, everything was stored in this basement. Upstairs, there was one bathroom. In this bathroom, there was a bathtub. That was very eccentric at the time, but the woman who took care of us was a Parisian. So she definitely had a bathtub. We took a bath every single week, every Saturday. And one warmed up the water on the stove. There was a stove in this living area, which was a kitchen living area. And there was a stove. We heated water. We would bring it upstairs in the bathtub, and Henry and I would take a bath together. We were scrubbed and cleaned. The bathroom played a big part. There was no toilet. There was an outhouse, and you had to use that outhouse. It was a dreadful experience with spiders and creepy crawlers and all kinds of things. And then there was the bedroom. In my recollection, we slept together, Henry, myself, Marraine, and when Adele was present, it was a big bed and we all slept in it. Whether we really did every time, all the time, I'm not sure. But that's what I remember about sleeping. And later, through bombardments, I remember the comfort of knowing that we were all together, huddled, and somewhat safe. Somewhat safe. There were bombings, and we had an abri. What's an abri? A dugout in the ground that we would go to. It was equipped with various things from the garden. That already takes me back to 1944 now. That's, the 2-year span. And bombings in that area of Belgium didn't take place until the very end of the war. And what I remember about that, of course, is actually being liberated by American troops. All through this, we were always listening to what I now realize is the BBC. I just knew it was a radio station, and we would turn it on and listen. So I knew about America. I knew about something about the war. American troops, black troops, came to liberate us. And in my life, I never dreamed that there was anything black in America. These were all black soldiers, and they were wonderfully kind and all that, but they were all black. So this was quite a surprise in my young life.
Okay, we're going to stop the tape here and we'll pick up there later.
I saw the little...
Richmond, tape 3. Trixie, I want to take you back a little bit because we kind of jumped up to liberation.
We did.
After the summer ended, what happened next to you?
After the summer ended, I was waiting for my father to come because the deal had been, when the summer's over, you come home. When my father came, I knew he wasn't coming to take me home. There had already been a harvest. It wouldn't have made sense. Actually, another story that I forgot to tell is going to Attigny. I had one doll with me. And what made me a little angry at my father is I had left it on the train and my father would not let me bring it with me. It was my most treasured possession. So I think I remembered that, and I wasn't too happy with my father for a long time. When he finally came and I realized that he wasn't going to take us home, there was a mixture, again, of being angry at my father, being hurt, realizing that if he was bringing extra clothing, and talking business, although I never knew what he was talking about with the sisters, I knew we were staying there. So this became quite a final situation, and we were almost, when my father left, almost within a day of that experience, we were told that we were going to become the niece and nephew of Marraine, this godmother of ours, who wasn't yet our godmother, but that we would be then converted officially and considered her niece and nephew from the city. This is what the village was going to know about us, because of course there would be questions. Why were we spending so much more time, and why were we staying there? After the war, I realized that entire village knew we were Jewish all the time. Every single person. Of course, there weren't zillions of people, but there were enough people. No one ever told. But we thought it was a secret, and we kept the story between the two of us. We became the best Catholics after our conversion. We literally loved being Catholic. We thought this was absolutely the Church, Virgin Mary, every saint. It was another movie in the making for us, for me especially. I wanted to be a Carmelite nun, and as this tape might reveal, I would have been sworn to silence for the rest of my life. I wouldn't have made it. But it was between being a Carmelite nun and a movie star, so at least I had two choices. But I threw myself into the Catholic religion quite seriously. More seriously than this woman, Marraine, and the very kind parish priest, Father Vaes, V-A-E-S, had ever anticipated. Because they wanted us to know that our roots were Jewish. And we needed to become ourselves again one day before we could make a decision about any future religion. Certainly, I understand now this was most unusual.
Let me back you up just a little bit. What did your father say to you this time when he was leaving?
He again said, "Au revoir, mon bébé," which just means goodbye, baby. But it was just his entire demeanor. I knew I might never. Nah, did I know, or have I been told? Or, I mean, I don't know. I've read so many letters since and written a book. I don't know whether I knew, allowed myself to know, or just perceived it as something not wonderful when he was leaving, especially because my mother was not there. And I didn't understand why my mother would not have come to see me also.
Did he give you any kind of instructions on behavior or what to say or what not to say?
Really, really not. And when I asked about my mother, the fact that she wasn't feeling well was not a surprise. So when I was told that she wasn't feeling good, I believed that. We knew how to behave. I knew, besides secrecy, we knew to be good because we needed to be accepted by whoever was taking care of us. And we knew this was a matter of survival, even in our unsophisticated children's minds. So I didn't need the instructions from my father.
And when he left, how did you react at that time?
Again, with the same self-protective sadness, but of brief duration. And there were so many distractions. There were so many things for us, knowing that life had not been very comfortable before. I think we could just throw ourselves into this country life. And I became a little hick. I just loved everything about the country.
What were some of the special moments for you?
The special moments were collecting eggs in the morning from chickens and really making all the food we collected. Picking vegetables, going and picking berries in the woods, even skinning rabbits and killing rabbits and eating rabbits, going to get milk, unpasteurized milk. We would walk, what seemed to be forever and ever, we would walk and walk and walk, but we would drink unpasteurized milk. Unbelievable. Horses would be killed in order for us to eat horse meat. Oh, we thought it was such a treat. And it was always fixed in a most delicious way. We helped to cook, we helped to clean. I think this earthy environment, I thrived on that. And though, again, the nights meant thinking of my mother and thinking of my father, and the fear of if anything happened to them, what would happen to me. And eventually being told by Father Vaes that my father had been killed. Coping with that.
Tell us about how that occurred.
My father had been killed escaping a transport. And although I didn't understand at the time about escaping transports, I understood from the priest, who was the person elected to tell me the story, that he had been severely wounded and that he was dead. But the severely wounded lingered longer than the dead part, partially because I really had not come in touch with anyone in my life, my immediate life, being dead. So I think there was a part of me that didn't want to face up to my father being dead. I was Catholic. I strongly believed if he in effect was dead, he was in heaven. And there was my mother. No one told me what had happened to my mother. So again, it was something I could only cope with for short periods of time. And although my diary, my poems tell a different story, that I certainly came in touch with it. I certainly told my feelings on paper. But in a daily thing, I did not. My life went on as I remember it.
Tell us about your diary.
And then there was my diary, which now I look at and I realize is meticulously well written. There are very few errors. There are my handwriting, which is hardly the same today, is so, it belies all the chaos that went on around me and certainly inside me. So the various things that I talk about in the diary are earth-shaking things, but written in a very grammatically correct way, with excellent spelling, considering that I was 11 years old. It amazes me as I look back at the poems also. It very, very, very nationalistic poems to the Belgian soldiers and French soldiers, and all this is part of the fantasy. It's a fantasy that really my parents gave me the ability to shut off what I couldn't handle.
Do you recall feeling those chaotic feelings inside of you?
Yes, I certainly remember those holes and those voids, and not, they weren't anything I could resolve. They were there.
And how did you cope with that?
Escape. Escape. Play the first movie that came. I always had Henry. Henry and I were just the dearest friends, and even more so because he did everything I told him to do. This changes through life, of course, but at that time, he was my buddy. So we would take off, and we would just do what we could handle. We played games.
Did you play with other village children?
Yes, we did. We did. And of course, we went to a makeshift school at times, as much as weather would permit or circumstances would permit. There were times when Germans did come into the town, and we were hidden in the woods. Well, we weren't afraid of that. We thought that was wonderful. We were left alone in the woods with food, and we thought we were Hansel and Gretel. We could only focus into the disaster as much as we were able, or as much as we understood, or permitted ourselves to do.
Did you actually see the German soldiers?
Yes. We spoke to, I remember only speaking to one soldier who, in my recollection, though I had been taught to be quite fearful of them, he wasn't any, he was just a German soldier who said hello.
And how long were you in hiding at these times?
In hiding in Atini, we were in hiding for 2 years.
No, I mean when the Germans came in, how frequently did that happen?
Just once, and we were just in hiding for a couple of days. But, it seemed like such a long time. Maren would come and bring us, various things. We spent the nights also.
What time of year was this?
I can't exactly remember, but it was a spring experience. It wasn't the dead of winter.
And did you have any nightmares during this period of time in your life?
Same nightmares. same nightmares.
Can you share those with us?
It's just fears, and really being a child that never slept and turning into an adult that never sleeps. I didn't go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning. I just didn't quite go to sleep at night.
Do any of those nightmares still stay with you to this day?
Well, I think by now those nightmares have been resolved.
And what thoughts and feelings did you have about your mother and father as these years progressed?
I never understood, deep down, fundamentally, that there might not have been another way for them. Starting with immigrating so late, although intellectually I can explain this all, it's been explained to me. For the very longest time, I never understood that my mother and father put me in someone else's keeping, feeling that they couldn't have. I felt, how did they know what would happen to them? You know, why did they abandon me? Even though my experiences are not remembered always and with great dread, I still felt that I was abandoned in a way. And with my own children, of course. My poor children, I could never quite let go of them in any situation. It was difficult to send my children to camp. It was difficult to separate from my children because these same thoughts, I felt that no one but me could take care of my children, that no one could do it better. And in a way, it was a throwback to my parents. Why didn't you do it better? And of course, that's, that became only too clear. I lost a 24-year-old son to a drunk driver on the highway. And I don't think I knew what loss was until that time in my life. And I also never understood my parents until that time in my life. There are times when you just are out of control, even though I was this very controlling and controlled little girl. There are times when there's nothing you can do about letting go. Whether it stood me in good stead to have done the losing, to have lost my parents, to have them as an example, to understand my grandmother, who after all had lost her own child. Even Marraine, who had to do the giving up after so much loving and caring after the war. Whether all this stood me in good stead as I was striving to get through the loss of my son, I think it did. I think it did. Finding those letters, writing a book, all that stood me in good stead. It was all very therapeutic. It doesn't change anything. But then there's, you just do the best you can with whatever life decided to hand you. So I came to accept what my parents did, and I understood that it took more love to let go of me than it would have to hang on. We would have all been killed. The feelings, the real basic feelings are hard to let go of. You can start to interfere with them as you grow older and smarter and wiser and whatever it is we're supposed to grow. But those holes inside, those dreadful fears that come at very inappropriate times, I think they're what I'm stuck with anyway.
Let's go back a little bit to your time in Belgium. Did you ever get punished while you were in Belgium?
Oh, appropriately, but quite appropriately. Marraine was a tall, slender, smoking person. She usually had a towel around her arm, and she used it for whatever she was doing in the kitchen. She was always doing something wonderful in the kitchen, but if we didn't mind, she would run after us. And yes, I remember being spanked with that towel. It never hurt too much, but she meant business. She was not fussy, unnecessarily fussy. She was loving and caring and nurturing in a very earthy way. And because she didn't have the same fears or sense of guilt that my parents had, she didn't need to overwhelm us with fussy love. And we knew we were cared about, we knew we were cared for. How lucky for me.
Was she affectionate towards you?
She was affectionate in a very natural way, yes, yes.
Do you remember any birthday celebrations or anything like that while you were there?
Actually, I don't remember birthday celebrations. Not in the country. I remember them later when I went back to my grandmother. But not in the country, no. We celebrated, just days were celebrations in that household.
And you had indicated that you and your cousin had become Catholic.
Yes.
Were you still aware of your Jewish roots, or was that not important at that time?
It wasn't important. I wanted not to keep my Jewish roots. He and I would always plan how we could stay Catholic in spite of my grandmother, and we knew that if my grandmother and my mother and his mother would ever know, this would be disastrous. But we had great plans. And always, they involved what a wonderful nun I would like to be.
Do you remember any holiday celebrations?
I remember Christmas.
Can you share that with us?
Yes, Christmas meant going to midnight mass, singing wonderful, wonderful Christmas songs, walking through crisp snow. There wasn't much snow, but whatever snow there was, I remembered because it was so unusual. I remember coming home to this little living area where we had actually cut down our own tree, and we had put it in the living room, and there were real candles on it, which we would light after coming home from midnight mass. And there were no gifts as such. There were things that Maren might have baked, and there was a wonderful meal around Christmas, and all the pageantry that went with Christmas. It took me a long time to get over Christmas. I remember it so distinctly. Mine didn't celebrate too many religious holidays. She didn't get into that at all. So this holiday was the most mysterious and the most eloquent in that household.
And let's move forward now. So for those 2 years, you don't recall being hungry or needy?
Never.
Okay.
Never.
And then what happened when the bombing started? When was that about?
The bombing started it was about 1944, and that was the beginning of real fears. Now we had to contend with parachutes coming down, not really understanding what a parachute was. Excuse me. I always thought that all the searchlights in the sky were airplanes falling and burning, and that those would be pilots who would fall to earth and come running after me. So I had this, talk about fantasy worlds, I had this imaginary vision of men hunting me. So hiding in this subterranean plot that we had dug became a fearful experience for me, because I thought that men would come from everywhere. There was something electrifying about looking at a sky that was filled with these searchlights. To call that an enjoyable experience, it was not for me. It was mixed with a great deal of fear. But even the adults around us, wanted to partake in what was happening, and besides hiding in the ground, so there was always this element of not taking it quite so seriously, which was foolish because there was a very important railroad station in Ottigny, and we understood that. And the Americans were after bombing that station in Ottigny. And they missed a lot, so there were huge craters, and we would play in them in the daytime, not even being aware that shrapnel could hurt, but all around us. Now there was the kind of war that I was experiencing and understanding. And bombing was, if I wasn't sleeping before, I was not sleeping now because the sirens would go off. Every single night you would leave your house, everything would be darkened, and you would certainly be in hiding from the bombing.
And how
in a shelter. I keep calling it abri. It's a shelter in the ground.
How did the adults around you explain this to you?
At that time, this was explained. War was explained to us. Who was fighting who? There was a radio. We came into contact with that in a pretty realistic fashion, as much as an 11-year-old would understand war. We did understand that. We understood it very well, and that the Americans were the Allies. Of course, it was hard to understand if they were the Allies. Why were they bombing us? But basically, we understood that they were saving us. And the Belgians were part of it, and the French were part of it, and we understood. And we were very nationalistic. I loved France because the woman who took care of me was French and Parisian. I loved the Belgians because I envisioned them as my protectors, and the American soldiers became something terribly glamorous, and so always was America, a most glamorous, Roosevelt, all those names rang as saviors for me, and were explained as such and taught as such.
So when did the soldiers march in, and what happened then?
When the soldiers marched in, it was an early morning day, and actually everyone was supposed to stay inside because I think there was a focus on what could happen with these soldiers. But we, of course, ran out. There were children everywhere running out. And the soldiers came. I remember the road. We lived up a hill in this little town. And I just remember dust in the road. And tanks and soldiers, and black soldiers, and more black soldiers. And there was screaming and yelling and all kinds of Vive la liberté, and calling out, all kinds of wonderful things about liberty and freedom and chewing gum. And of all the things that stick out in my mind is this chewing gum, which Marraine would not allow anyone to touch. She was more suspicious of the chewing gum than she was of the soldiers, because in her life experience, of course, she had seen black, whether they were soldiers or not, she knew coming from France that there were black people, but we didn't. So all of it was mysterious and intriguing and something we wanted to talk about and see and touch. But they went just about as quickly as they came. And Ottigny as such did not remain a very important seat for the American. It was Patton's army, I was told later, of course. But it didn't remain a very important seat for an army.
And when was this?
This was in the spring. Was it in the spring?
Of 44?
Of 44. I'm not sure if it was in the spring or in the fall of 44.
And what happened next in your life?
I should be, after writing a book. That's the thing about writing a book. You can correct yourself and look it up all the time when you're talking. Say it right. After that, we went back to Belgium very quickly. And it was in the spring, because we went back, yes, it was in the spring summer because we went back in the fall to my grandmother. And that was very difficult. Leaving Marin was an experience that I couldn't even conceive at that point. And my grandmother's life had been very difficult and very constricted to one room and no food and losing a child and many explanations that she would have to make to me. And my grandmother had gotten so old. And I didn't think I wanted to be with my grandmother. And even Henry didn't want to be with his mother. So now began a very difficult trek in Brussels of two Catholic children with a grandmother who was, if ever Jewish, more aware of her roots.
Okay, we need to stop here, change tapes. Before. Trixie, we ended up the last tape, we were talking a little bit about your grandmother, but I'd like to bring you back a little bit to right after liberation. Tell us what or how people heard from your family and what happened then.
Okay. First of all, I need to explain that memory is selective, and these are my recollections. But I have since then, of course, found out that there was communication through an underground, especially because of my aunt, my cousin's mother, Frida Horwitz, who was able to send certain amounts of monies and whatever, a few things that were needed by us, but we never knew it. Nor were we allowed to find out about it because obviously we were children. We might have talked and we might have given away their whereabouts. So it was unbeknown to me exactly how any of these things ever happened. When the war was over, of course, then we heard, during this period of time, I also had, I have a letter in my possession that I had written to my mother and father who were already deported, thinking that they might get this letter. I didn't even realize, nor was I told, that the letter never was sent out. So I have a letter that I wrote that never was sent out. This is the kind of thing that was taking place. After the war, then my aunt came into open communication with Marin, and we knew where my grandmother was and where my aunt had lived. Whether we actually, I didn't understand what it meant to have survived this war. How could I? In any other context than the one that I had survived it in. So again, getting back there to Brussels, suddenly being separated from Henry, who went to live with his mother, and I went to live with my grandmother. I was brought there by Marin, who treated this like a very formal experience. She put on her one city suit, took us on the train, took us back, and really gave us up. And the pain was so obvious all around. It wasn't just Henry and I suffering. It was also Marin, who had become so attached and had been so loving, and after all had taken her life in her hands by sheltering us. None of this did I want to do. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to really be with my grandmother, who must have been so thrilled to still have me and gone through so much trouble. I remember this room, this little room that we were going to live in, being dressed up as far as she could dress it up with cookies, which I didn't even realize what a sacrifice that was. She had food stamps. She had hardly enough to eat for herself. But she surely spent them all on whatever little things she had ready for me. And I must have been a brat. I certainly was not appreciative. And my grandmother knew that is not where I wanted to be. And my expectations were enormous. I wanted things for myself. I wanted to be taken to the movies. I wanted to play with my cousin, whose mother was so thrilled to have him back, but who also did not want to be back with his mother. And he and I would go on long walks around a lake. And when I go back to Brussels, I can still envision the lake, and scheme how we would escape back to Attigny, so that we could remain Catholic and we wouldn't have to be Jewish and change our entire lives. The fact that by now I had learned about my mother and my father was almost, I knew exactly what had happened to my father, but I knew that my mother was missing. We would go to the train station, we would be looking for my mother. I couldn't face that I wouldn't see my mother again. For years I was looking for my mother on the street. And even through later coming to this country and being adopted, I was certain that my mother was somewhere on some street and I would run into her. So it isn't something that I accepted easily. Henry's father had been killed, also in Auschwitz. Henry's mother had a friend with whom she was living who was taking care of financial needs for them. And he had his own difficult times. My aunt, my grandmother had no patience. We were Jewish, that's what there was to it. But my aunt understood better that she needed to do more about our re-entering into the Jewish faith. By this time, we were 12. And she would take us on picnics. She would give us a choice. You want to go to church, you can go to church, but you want to go on a picnic, we have wonderful food. And food was a rarity. So my cousin gave in very quickly. Not so did I. So I, for a long time, was not about to do this thing on Sundays. I wanted to be in a church. But eventually I gave in, and eventually things just happened. My grandmother needed to give me up and put me in the care of a family that had been friends of my parents. Mysteriously, this family survived the war. I will never understand how. They were very, very wealthy and quite able to take care of me. So I was put in the care of this family.
How long was this after?
This was not a year, months, 2 or 3 months. My grandmother was not able to take care of me. She didn't have the finances, and she had lived through a lot. And at that time, being 65 was really considered old, because in the letters that I read, my poor grandmother was always treated like really quite an old lady, and here I am, But it was for her very old. She had survived great odds alone. So I went to stay with this family, and that was a very traumatic thing for me. I couldn't understand being given away. I would have rather been near my cousin and with my grandmother without all these surrounding material privileges that I was now getting. I had a little rabbit coat and piano lessons, and I could have gone to any school that my grandmother would have permitted me to go to. They wanted to send me to dancing school, and my grandmother didn't think that was right, so I didn't go to dancing school. But these people had their own daughter and wanted a companion for her. And that's what I became. I became her companion. I remember I don't remember that time in my life with great cheer. My cousin would come to visit. Even Marraine came once. And my grandmother came. These were Sunday visits or birthday visits. But I felt very shut out of things. And having been accustomed to such an earthy, loving environment, here I was in this environment, this very wealthy family with tons of help around. The mother was hardly, these were Jewish friends of my parents from many, many years ago. And certainly they were kind, because otherwise I'm sure they, why take me otherwise? But their care wasn't loving in the sense that I had been accustomed to, and it was a very difficult adjustment. When I went back to my grandmother, I went back because by then the situation in this country had been resolved, and we had gotten our exit visas, and my aunt and uncle, who had come to live in Chicago, Illinois at that time, were sending for us. So I spent some months in Uccle, which was this very elegant suburb of Brussels, basically unhurt by the war. And then I spent the rest of the time until 1946 when we came to this country. So there was this interim between 44 and 46 where I was in and out of my grandmother's home with these people whose name was Smarag, S-Z-M-A-R-A-G. I think they were Austrian Jews. And I never stayed in touch. I don't know what happened to them.
How long were you with them?
I was with them for a matter of months. I think my diary would tell for a half a year.
And then how did you happen to come back to your grandmother?
I wasn't happy, and my grandmother just took me back. And then we did everything. My poor grandmother, I'm sure I instilled a lot of guilt. She did everything I wanted to do. All her food stamps were for what I wanted to eat, and I saw movies of Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy 15 million times over and over again. And of course, I got to see my cousin, and we played. And by this time, Catholicism was playing a less important role, but it was there between the two of us, my cousin and myself.
Had you re-embraced Judaism at all at this point?
Not formally at all. Not formally at all.
What happened? I'm sorry, go ahead.
It was probably a smart thing for my grandmother not. We went to synagogue. I remember the first Rosh Hashanah and standing in front of a synagogue, but I remember it with not the wonderful feelings of Berlin. I remember it with very foreign, dark, but of course there had been this dreadful interim. And here were these adults who were fully aware of what had taken place. And there was a synagogue, and there was a Rosh Hashanah and a Yom Kippur. We did re-enter in that way with my aunt. No more pageantry. Those were the real hard facts then. So Judaism did not come back into my life in an appealing way. How could it?
And how did you find out about your mother? When did you hear about that?
Throughout that period with my aunt, of course, who was a very smart lady, knew all these things. And slowly but surely, all the stories came to be told. They were in bits and pieces. And remember, we were always waiting for my mother to reappear. No one faced the fact at any time that she was gone. She would come back. This was but we knew how she had been, that she had obviously been taken away from Malines, this holding camp in Brussels. That the transport went to Auschwitz was not a certainty at the time. None of these things became a certainty for me until I read Maxime Steinberg's, the Belgian historian's, book and started writing my own book. Part of it, perhaps, I just really couldn't look into the facts, which is amazing to me. And part of it is because Maxime Steinberg hadn't done the research. He is this Belgian historian who is my age and a child survivor at the same period of time in Belgium. But the stories, the story about my father, there was little doubt about it. And we visited his grave, where he was buried with Christians and Jews alike in this same area, which was called Tir-le-Mont, where he had jumped off the transport and gotten killed. It was all part of a partisan effort to save the Jews. It was the first known partisan effort in Belgium, where non-Jews and Jews alike came in from the outside into Malines, this holding camp, and prepared the Jews for the escape from Transport 20. I didn't know at the time that this was a historical transport. I didn't know anything like that. But I did know there was a Christian doctor, that when my father was severely wounded, he was taken into that home. That was all told to me. But even then, my mind had a great way of doing tricks. You know, I would handle what I could and carry on.
So what happened next in your life?
And next in my life then came immigration, going to the United States, which filled every day with joyful expectations. We were getting packages from my aunt and uncle in Chicago with, I remember, butter in cans and things that now I can't imagine how they were able to put in cans, but clothes that did and didn't fit. But I always thought they were the most beautiful things, whatever was sent me, plaid skirts that were in style, and I have long letters, you know, to verify all this, all the things that we needed that my grandmother, my aunt, and that my aunt and uncle, who were struggling themselves, were trying to send us. And all the while, this immense expectation that everything would be wonderful in the United States. And it was the land of the free and the Statue of Liberty, and my head was filled with those thoughts that I needed. On the one hand, I needed to look forward and have these thoughts, and they were verified by every adult in my life. So we left from Le Havre and got on this unbelievable ship. As I look back, I mean, I thought it was the greatest thing ever. As I look back on how ill we all were, I know it wasn't. It was called the Uruguay, and it was the kind of transport ship that everybody was sent over on. It was hardly glamorous, but everybody was very friendly, the sailors, and I just remember thinking, you know, another movie in the making here. And I wrote about it also in diary form, which I still have, and dancing and being sick to my stomach and all these episodes. But all the discomforts, and my poor grandmother had to put up with me through all this. And my grandmother, from that moment on, I remember her only wearing black. From a very pudgy, wonderfully friendly appearing little person, she had turned into really a minuscule human being in black. But she did her best, and she was able to put up with me. That was certainly doing her best. And this ship took a week, and I remember the morning that we saw the Statue of Liberty. My goodness, you know, that would solve every problem. And the distance, putting this humongous distance between myself and Belgium, was very helpful for me because, of course, I've since spoken to my cousin who remained in Brussels, but he remained with his mother, which naturally, it gave him a better sense of history than it did me. Because I came here, I was overwhelmed with things. When I arrived here, my aunt and uncle had every single thing that a child would have collected over a period of all these years. They were waiting for me on a table, ice skates and bicycles and sleds and everything, clothes, and it was actually on my 13th birthday. And it was understood without any further to do that I would be adopted. There was no touching on my past life. There was, and my grandmother was reasonably silent about it anyway. But my aunt and uncle had no questions. It was amazing. And for years, I didn't understand the similarity in their reaction and that of many survivors. It was an untouchable subject. It probably did me justice in as much as it permitted me to become this all-American. I was more American than American. I was not going to be either a refugee or a child with an accent. I was going to be the typical American teenager. I imitated everything and everybody. I was a leader. Everybody was my best friend. I just left everything behind me. I was permitted to do that. I wasn't allowed to speak German in the house, so I had to learn English very quickly, even though my parents spoke with very thick accents. My adoptive parents, my aunt and uncle. My grandmother lived with us and encouraged loyalty to them, although her sadness, a part of her was totally dead. My grandmother, though she always tried to learn English, she strived also to be part of this country. I can only understand now what she was living through. And I wanted to disassociate myself even from my grandmother. I wanted to have a normal family. I wanted to have a mother. I wanted to have a father. I didn't want to hear those dreadful stories. And in a way, their silence permitted me to do these things. And in that time, although it was quite difficult to become adjusted to this new house with rules and regulations and totally different from what I had lived with Marraine, the freedom, and more than anything, again, being treated like a child. You know, I was a child, and I think my aunt and uncle were very suspicious of some of the things they had read in letters. I had a big mouth, and I was rebellious, and how would they treat this? They were terribly severe and terribly strict. There were more rules than I had dreamed existed. But I learned to play that game. For a while, it was just a game. But at the same time, it permitted me, as I look back now, to become a rebellious teenager. So I was more American and more typically teenager than I would have been had this kind of rebellion not been imposed on me in a way. So there wasn't a week without a date. I always had to be home at 10 o'clock. And I entered this life pretty much forgetting what I would eventually have to face up to.
So when you came over from Belgium, it was just you and your grandmother?
Yes.
How come Henri's family decided not to come?
His mother was living with a man who was her husband's very dear friend. Her husband, of course, had been killed in Auschwitz. Not of course, but he had been killed in Auschwitz. And this man became a legal representative for restitution money to Jews in Germany. So he was making his living, he was earning his living in Germany. She actually moved back to Cologne with him, and my cousin went back to live with Marraine. And he would go to the university, would attend school, and then the University of Brussels by commuting back and forth from Attigny, which was only 20 miles away, but it seemed forever, of course. But he stayed in Brussels simply because this is what his family decided to do because of financial reasons. And my mother, in a letter that I found later, and I was told this, that my mother, if anything happened to my parents, my mother had written that she wanted me adopted by the aunt and uncle who lived in this country. So this was it was decided that this is what would happen. And I had no question that this is what I wanted to do. They had been my favorite aunt and uncle before the war. Why would they not remain so after the war? And they were wonderful. And in effect did do all the things that my mother would have wanted for them to do.
Did you stay in touch with Henri during this time?
I did not. For a long time, I wanted no part of writing. I did write to Marraine, and I would occasionally send her money. She didn't answer. She was very ill. She had cancer. And I didn't even understand the scope of that. But in my, whatever, thoughtless or need, God bless you, in my need to survive the moment, those things that were not going to service my survival, I was going to need to put aside. So I didn't write again to Henry until he graduated from university. Many years passed. My aunt wrote. The adults in my life wrote. I actually forgot German for a long time. I never wanted to touch it. I helped my grandmother with her English lessons, and only because of her would I still speak German, because she didn't speak another language. But it was strictly French and English for me.
Tell me about your education once you got to this country.
Once I got to this country, although I really hadn't been to school very much, I entered Bret Harte Grammar School in the Hyde Park region of the Chicago area. And I was placed in the 8th grade. I never had any tutoring. I never had any help. It just worked for me. So much for homeschooling, actually. Maybe you learn more out of schools than you do in. I never had a problem. I loved school. I loved the social aspects. I loved school. I've always loved school. Then I went to Hyde Park High School, where I absolutely became a social butterfly. I was on the stage all the time, in every activity that centered around singing and dancing. No one, and I realize this now because I have so many friends from those days, no one really knew what my life had been all about, and that was the purpose, I suppose, all the while. And to Margot and Werner, my adoptive parents, my aunt and uncle, this must have been gratifying, because I think that was consciously or subconsciously the purpose. From Hyde Park High School, I went to the University of Illinois, where I met my husband just about the first day on the tennis court. I can see him still. And he was the most American person I could have ever met. He was more American than his family was Russian, Jewish. But they were the kinds of immigrants that didn't ever want to speak a word of English. His grandmother wanted to be totally American. She watched all the baseball games and knew all the football scores. And the Russian versus the German, the warmth of his family, that's what brought me back, really brought me back to Judaism. Because I had, before this, been totally unfamiliar with that kind of warmth. It wasn't necessarily an observant, it was always observant. Everybody observed everything with family. It was family getting together. And of course I had so little family. Here was this big family, always around tables and eating. It must have been a throwback to Berlin for me. And I don't know to this day whether I loved his mother and his grandmother best or my husband, but it was wonderful. And my real sense of Judaism came back to me.
Okay, we're going to stop this tape here. Tape 5. Trixie, let's back up a little bit. Did you have a bat mitzvah or anything?
I was confirmed when I was 16 years old. But again, it was more of a ritual. That's why I said that when I met my husband and his family, I fundamentally came back in touch with Judaism. I had spoken to a rabbi privately, and then Isaiah Israel was the congregation in Hyde Park, Rabbi Berman, but really back in touch with Judaism. It took Erwin, my husband, Erwin Muchman, and I think both of us consider ourselves secular Jews, but we are very much Jews. and so are our children. We got married on the 12th of June, 1954, and from then on, talk about a wonderful fantasy life. It was a wonderful life. We had 2 kids, boom, boom, my daughter Wendy, Wendy Jo, who was actually born in Lawton, Oklahoma, where my husband was in the service in the ROTC for 2 years. And after that, she was born in 1956 and 1958. My son was born, Robert, called Robbie. It was a wonderful life. We were the 4 great Muchmans. I thought that, my life was an umbrella and that nothing could happen to my family. My kids were wonderful. My son, at the age of 24, both my children went to law school, and my son was, in 1982, he was going to get married, 6 months hence, as a matter of fact, and he was 24 years old. He had life ahead of him. And me as an umbrella. Sure. So on the Dan Ryan, at the age of 24, with my daughter, both of them had come to see us. We had just come home from Italy. And the children had come to see us to say hello, and they were on their way home. Robbie was passing the bar, and a drunk driver just smashed head-on into the car. My daughter walked away. She's had that to survive herself. And my son was killed instantly. And I knew when that phone call came from Wendy. She called us and she said, Robbie's unconscious. And I knew when I got to that hospital, it was sort of like not wanting to face that my mother or my father were dead. But I knew I had been there before, and I knew this wasn't going to be wonderful. And Robbie was killed. He was dead. And then I learned what surviving was all about. Because I wasn't a child, fantasy wasn't going to do the trick, and I had to revisit all those places and all those times. And I did it with the most wonderful husband I ever could have picked in my lifetime, an all-American boy. And my daughter, who couldn't have been more supportive and had her own life to support. But that kind of survival, that's being put to the task. And the tricks from before, they didn't work. Playing movie stars. When life starts coming back, because you faced all the things that, when I faced all the things that I never could face before, one by one, when I saw that if I had the resources to get through that part of my life, those young years, I would manage to get through these years. And I did, in a different way. I wrote a book. When my adoptive father was killed, Wendy found letters, and all the letters from those adults, my mother, my father, from camps, all those letters had been hidden from me all those years. But when I found those letters, I knew I had to translate all of them, 100 letters. And I could see as an adult all the love that surrounded me when I was a child, the courage that it took my parents to give me up, the courage, the love, the sacrifice. And I felt through translating these letters and writing this book and finally publishing this book and touching other lives of people who have lived through other tragedies, I found that there is a way to face really The Holocaust was unimaginable, but this is too. A parent, it's impossible to imagine losing a child. Not in our consciousness, not in mine. So here I am telling you the story. And I guess that I don't believe that things happen for the good, for some good greater purpose, but I do believe that there is an energy beyond us. That there is something, there has to be an ongoing energy. So be it in the form of God, be it in the form of any energy, I believe that there is a greater force at work. And that somehow, when we need it, it comes forth, it takes over for us. Anyway, what choice is there in life? So here I am, still continue to be blessed by my wonderful husband, by my precious daughter, and now her precious son. She has a lovely husband. And again, we have a wonderful family that continues to be a family, and find many joys in being a family. And maybe more joys because I know how tentative all these things really are. Being 13 is not necessarily the end of trauma. It can be the beginning of great things, but that life has a lot of things in store. And we never know. It's just when we look over our shoulder what happens next. So this book, Never to Be Forgotten, a young girl's Holocaust memoir, is a memoir about my years as a child. It's easier to write a book than to speak like this because you can erase mistakes. But in life you really can't erase mistakes. You just live it as best you know how, and this is really the best that any human being can do. And maybe that's something you have to come to grips with as you get older and wiser. So this book tells the story and it gave some meaning perhaps to all the losses and it's something for my daughter and her son and really for myself. It's quite a present for myself to finally face up to all those things that happened. And really this oral history is part of this facing up. It's something I could never do before. And I did this partially with Shoah because of Dr. Berenbaum, who was kind enough to review my book, and partially because it's time, and I was able to do it.
And we're very grateful that you were.
I thank you for taking it.
Couple just last-minute questions. Have you ever discussed your experiences in the Holocaust with your daughter?
Yes. Yes. Not as intimately as I did in the book, or as not as continually and intimately as I did today either.
Have you ever returned to your hometown or to the places you were during the Holocaust?
We returned to Belgium with our children a lot. We went back to Attigny. We retraced all of our steps. We went back to where my father was buried and died. Yes, frequently, and even recently. And my cousins are in this country a lot, too. And I feel exceptionally close to their two daughters, who are just wonderful young girls, all very conscious of their heritage.
Did you ever go back to Berlin?
Never. But I might.
How did it feel and how did your family react when you took them the first time and explained things to them?
Very touchingly. They reacted, they were very touched. They were very touched. I always need to step back and remember my reactions when I was young. You know, how How much can children who are so identified with a parent who was a Holocaust survivor, how much can they absorb? Do they want to absorb? But my daughter is a very sensitive young woman. And I think she absorbs what she needs to absorb.
Now, 50 years later, what message or lesson do you have for your daughter, your grandchild, for the world?
I wouldn't be so presumptuous as to give a message to the world, let alone my daughter. I think everyone has to find his own message. And I think my daughter will find her own message. Everything changes. And if you're able, I think for myself, because I was flexible and I was able to be flexible, I survived what I had to survive, but I'm sure Wendy, my daughter, will have her own life to survive. And she needs to know that. She needs to know that she's not surviving my life, she's surviving her own. And everything that will happen to her is every bit as important as what has happened to me. I think that those are problems for children of survivors. They can never quite do all that. But for the world, be discerning. Don't just read headlines in newspapers. Learn to be critical.
If you had one thing that you wanted people to remember out of all of this, what would that be?
To remember it. To not forget. To remember that there can be complete, utter, and total evil, even though within that evil there is individual goodness. But remember it.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we close?
I thank you.
We thank you so much.
Thank you. The pre-war photographs were found among my grandmother's possessions. She gave some of them to me. Some of them were with my aunt and uncle, Margaret and Warner Louis, so that between Mimi, my grandmother, and my aunt and uncle, I have some of these in my own possession. This is 1932, my mother and father's wedding date. This is Meta, now Westheimer, Meta Boas Westheimer, and Julius Westheimer, who undoubtedly was very proud to take this woman as his lawful wedded wife. This is me, Beatrix, at that time Westheimer, but Trixie undoubtedly, because I was 2.5 years old, called Trixie. My mother made the wreath in my hair. She also designed and made the dress and certainly worked very hard over that smocking. I don't know if I looked so happy in there, but that's it. And my mother, who continued to make these beautiful clothes right after her wedding. My mother also wanted very much to be a ballerina or an actress. My beautiful mother, Meta, already Westheimer, in such a beautiful dress. I love her fingers. And of course she's displaying her ring. And as pictured in my book, Never to Be Forgotten, this is a photograph of Julius Westheimer, my father, and myself at that time around 4 years old. Again, the dress was made by my mother. My father, my handsome father, certainly looks proud. And the smocking, my mother made the smocking. And the curls, on wooden curlers, she would twist those corkscrews. And that's my dear cousin Henry with Marraine. Doesn't she just have the most wonderful look on her face? That's just a typical picture of Marraine. And me, again with those long curls that everybody worked hard at preserving. That was in Otigny, 1943. 1943, Henry was a choir boy, and I had my first communion. That was the day. In Otigny. 1946, this is how Warner, my uncle and adoptive father, looked then and looked almost till he was 86 years old. He was the most handsome, debonair, and kind man. 6 foot, I want to say 2. In Brussels, 1946, just before we came, it could have even been a little closer to 1945, my grandmother, who was always overweight, this is what happened to my grandmother. She became a very minute, dressed in black person. And my goodness, I certainly look, these are all American clothes that were sent to me. I certainly look like I'm going to tackle the world here. 1952, this is Erwin Muchman, my husband-to-be at the time, and myself at the University of Illinois. I was the sweetheart of Tau Epsilon Phi, his fraternity. I certainly thought I was glamorous. 1954, I married the all-American dream, my husband, Erwin Muchman, and myself on our wedding date at the Windermere Hotel in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Chicago. 1962, we couldn't afford this photograph. We went to Joe Banks, at that time very famous artist and photographer. Robbie, my son, would not stop crying. We finally snapped this picture, but Wendy was delighted with the whole thing. This was 1970. Robbie is to the left, Wendy right next to him. Wendy was about 16 years old. Next to her is my husband, Erwin, and Werner Louis, my adoptive father. Next to him, I am standing, and in front, the very tiniest person of all, was Margot Louis, my adoptive mother. It was a nice family portrait. This would have been around 1977 at the University of Illinois. Robbie, with his darling girlfriend who was to become his fiancée, Jill Goldberg. Those were very good days for Robbie. He was very much in love. This was after college graduation. My son Robbie was in law school at the time. He was sporting a beard and a mustache, and he was ready to tackle the world.
And what year was this?
It would have been about 1981. And this was taken in 1995. That's my wonderful, wonderful mother-in-law, Anita Muchman. She was my best, best friend. She's in the lower right of the picture next to my grandson, Robert Julius Muchman Rafer. And right holding him is my daughter, Wendy. And right next to my daughter, Wendy, that's me.
And what year was this?
And that was it would have been 2 years ago, so about 1995. And as mentioned in the interview, in May 1997, I published Never to Be Forgotten, a young girl's Holocaust memoir. Katav published it for me. And the pansy, as indicated on the book, is a reproduction of the pansy I picked on my father's grave. And the book designer was very sensitive in catching the essence really of my life on this book. This is the love of my life, my little grandson, Robert Julius. Robert, do you have something to say, darling?
No.
Nothing? What do you think about Nani?
I'm not looking at.
Huh?
No, don't.
Oh, okay. You don't want me to talk to you? You don't want to say anything? For the camera?
No.
Okay. You don't want to share anything with us?
No.
Hi, Robert. Do you want to tell us about Nani?
No.
Okay, then I will. I'm Wendy Muchman, Trixie's daughter. Growing up with my mom, I always knew that she had been a hidden child in Belgium. And I think as a child, I knew it, but it was such a hard thing to understand. My mother was outwardly just like everyone else's mother. I was always very proud of her. She was never the type of mother, I never went through that teenage age where I was embarrassed of my mother, because my mother was always the coolest mother. Everyone wanted to come to my house to spend time with my mother, and all my friends always thought I was so lucky to have her for my mother. Including, she even was a student teacher at the junior high school where I went, and everyone wanted to be in her French class because they thought she was the best. I've been proud of her as long as I can remember, and she has never ceased to amaze me. She's someone who has overcome things that are beyond my wildest imagination, and who has never stopped trying, and has taught me that no matter what happens in life, you should always try, and things can always get better, and you never know what's around the corner if you just pick your head up and keep trying. I love you, Ma.
Love you, Mom.
Oh, no. The all-American boy, we're losing you here. This is the biggest optimist of all time.
I'm usually really in control, but once in a while I'm not. Anyway, when I met Trixie, my name's Erwin Muchman, I'm Trixie's husband. And excuse me.
No.
I guess I'm thinking about. Okay. I guess when I met Trixie, although I knew about her past, since she never spoke with any accent from the time I met her at the University of Illinois, compared to most of the other people who lived through somewhat similar circumstance, she was different than other people who had come through that type of experience. Excuse me for crying. I guess I was thinking about my son and how much he would have enjoyed reading her book. Anyway, what's Trixie all about? She's a very protective person to everybody in her life that's important. She's very determined. She's got a wide variety of talents, and I think she's amazed all of us in the fact that she's never written a book before. She never took a class in it, but she was so determined that by just sheer determination, she made all this happen for herself. And we love
Ah, and you're especially wonderful. You and Wendy. And Robert, even if you didn't say anything about Nanny. Now you're
Now you're shy?